Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Gabriel, the program coordinator for the Lewisboro Library. Sharing this program with us tonight is the Pound Ridge Library, and under the auspices of Marilyn Tinter. Tonight's program is called How to Use Artificial Intelligence, and it's presented by Jacob Adler, who is the Metadata and Cataloging Librarian at the Bronx Community College Library. Jake is the author of a subject guide on generative systems that is accessible via the college library website. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you very much, Liz. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So I wanted to talk to you tonight. I'm going to share my screen now. I wanted to talk to everyone tonight about what I call generative systems, which is things that you've probably seen a lot of in the news and the media lately, things like ChatGPT and Google's Bard and that Bing AI from Microsoft and all kinds of things that are having an enormous impact these days. And there's a huge preponderance of information about them. So I wanted to try and sort of condense it down into the things that perhaps might want to know about them and how best to utilize them. So, what is a generative system exactly? Well, there's a lot of variety to them, but generally, what they all are large language models. Now, what is a large language model? Well, according to the new stack, it is a type of program that is characterized by having a very large size and is capable of incorporating billions upon billions, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, of different data points into what they call a neural network. Essentially, it is a digital entity that is designed to amass and make connections between huge amounts of data in ways that are not quite as readily accessible to traditional methods of interfacing with a computer. You might ask a question of a search engine and get results, but these generative systems, these large language models, are able to not only give you results, but to make connections between different results in ways that can generate information in a different way. Now, there are quite a lot of them out there these days. Generally, they can be either a generalized system, which means that they don't have a specific pre-built purpose. They just sort of can do whatever task is kind of assigned of them, or they can be very specialized. They can be created to perform very particular functions. Now, some of those, in either case, include being used in a professional or corporate capacity. I think you may have probably seen a lot about this sort of thing, in the news, where people are using these things to perform different job tasks. They're using them to facilitate communication, either between, their own workplaces and companies or, externally to other entities. They are used in writing quite extensively. They're used to generate very large amounts of text or other content in a very short amount of time. Uh, the way that I first became engaged with them was through an academic context, through kind of a scholarly research context. There are a lot of questions that can be answered using generative systems in ways that are very complex to do, or at least very time consuming to do, with traditional search methodologies ranging from, search engines to scholarly databases or journals. Now, this is not without its own sort of caveats, which you'll see an example of later. Um, there's also a lot of emerging usage of generative systems in a science context. They're not just in computer science, where there's been a lot of stories about the ways that people who are really good with programming language are using them to, expedite their work. But there's also some very creative uses. I was hearing recently, for example, about how like genetic scientists are using generative systems to help them with planning out the folding of proteins, which was this very mathematically complex task that had to be sourced out to a huge number of individuals in the past, but now can be performed in a much faster sort of time frame. Um, Another thing you've probably seen a lot of talk about in terms of generative systems is their potential for use in artistic or creative projects. This is especially evident in the usage of image generators. There's quite a lot of those out these days, and they've been able to create a lot of really interesting work and, in some cases, some very controversial work. I don't know if any of you saw earlier this year, there was a artist who generated a bit of controversy out in the Midwest because he won this art competition using an image that he had generated through an image generator called Midjourney. And there was a lot of debate and question as to whether or not it was deserved or not, and on how much he could be credited. There's a lot of issues about that. And that's still very much a developing sort of discussion that's happening. Um, the other sort of dimension of this is that generative systems can be wonderfully entertaining. Maybe this is somewhat more of a frivolous use than others, but I'm sure by now you've heard about people generating funny little poems or coming up with lyrics or, playing little games with them. As a matter of fact, earlier today, the New York Times was running a story about how a bunch of computer scientists at NVIDIA, the computer chip maker, have been training generative systems on how to play video games. Now they're playing Minecraft apparently, which is kind of funny, but also gives you an idea of just how many tasks these generative systems can actually do once someone gets an idea with them. It's not all fun and games though, literally. Uh, Generative systems also have a great potential for spreading disinformation or for creating content that is similar enough to pre-existing content that it reads as being plagiarized. And this is a big issue, particularly where I work in academia. There's been an enormous amount of talk about academic integrity and critical thinking and how these things can potentially impact them. And so that is something to keep in mind. Now, some of the advantages, at least in my experience of using a generative system, I think the primary one, and I've touched on it a little bit already, is the speed of them. Um, because they can accept much more complex or multi-part questions than would otherwise be feasible with electronic technology, they can arrive at an answer, a desired outcome, in a lot much more efficiently than a lot of programming could before. And so it's not necessarily that it's making people better at doing things, but it can get them to where they need to be faster. This is especially evident, again, in computer programming, where, from what I understand, you need to be already very proficient in it in order to make full advantage of it. And part of the reason why they can operate this way is because, unlike again, a lot of previous methodologies, they're user oriented, they're intuitive. The way that they're structured is that most generative systems respond to much more naturalistic language. You can ask them a question in very much a similar way that you would ask another person to some extent. And so that can lead to a lot more nuance and a lot more precision. They are what I like to call conversational because you can continue queries in a generative system, and it will, for lack of a better term, remember what was said before and will be able to couch its answers in that same kind of frame. So if you're speaking to them about like a math question, and then you ask about an outcome derived from that math question that maybe is not itself related to math, it will more or less be able to follow your train of thought. It's not perfect, but it's much more of an advance than was before. The disadvantages of using generative systems, the primary one I think is that they lack consistency. The same person could ask the same question of, either different generative systems or even the same one multiple times, and there's no guarantee that it will produce the same answer. It's not just a sort of thing where you can follow a recipe and expect it to come out the same every time. Because there's an element of randomization to it and an element of context, it decreases the likelihood that it will arrive at the same outcome. Moreover, generative systems, much like any other kind of information we consume, are prone to bias because, again, they're created by absorbing information from different data points. And if those data points have a pre existing bias to them, then unfortunately that will be incorporated into the system as well. Now, a lot of the companies that create generative systems are trying to take steps to avoid that, uh, but it's not a perfect system. And to me, the scarier thing is that there are people out there who are trying to create new systems that are specifically programmed with pre existing biases, which I don't think is very helpful for anybody, but there you are. Uh, the main disadvantage I think that probably a lot of you are familiar with, in addition to that, is that generative systems are prone to what they call hallucination, which is when they sort of seize upon an idea that is totally outside of reality or totally off base, and then will sort of go on its own sort of tangent into a place that is not particularly helpful for the end user. That's very similar to the bias question because, again, not all data points are infallible. And so the machine, therefore, becomes, in a sense, it sort of takes on some of that fallibility. Now, this next point, I don't think is an advantage or a disadvantage, but it's something that I have talked about before, and it's sort of I think I'm sort of in the minority opinion about this. I personally do not consider these things to be artificial intelligence. I know that that's the name of the presentation, and I know that most people will just refer to these things as AI out of shorthand, and it's not necessarily wrong to do that. But I think that what is a little bit problematic is when people start ascribing anthropomorphic traits to these generative systems when they very much are not. There was a research paper that came out, I think about 2 months ago now, by these really top high level AI researchers, like I think about 20 of them. And they put out this big long paper that went into kind of the details about not just sort of what artificial intelligence is at this point, but how we would be able to interpret it and how we would be able to tell if it is or is not an artificial intelligence. And it was very complex, but the upshot of it was that they're saying that we don't really have hard evidence right now that any of these things qualify as artificial intelligence, but that's not to say that we won't ever have that evidence. And so it's interesting that this question is being raised now and is being discussed. The other thing that I think is important to know about these generative systems, and I think probably this is also something you've encountered in the news or in media, particularly in the last few months, is that it can be a little bit tricky to determine whether or not, a block of text or an image is a real thing or was generated by a machine. And I'll speak more on that a little bit later. So, just to give you an idea of how many of these things are out there these days, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but the one that probably most of you are familiar with by now is ChatGPT, which is made by a company called OpenAI. This was really the first one to gain a special prominence and to really make some waves when it came out a little bit after, just about a year ago now, just to give you an idea of how fast all this stuff goes. Right now, they are working. The current most advanced version is ChatGPT 4, although that's a paid version. The free version is 3.5. It was 3, and then it got updated, I think, sometime in August. And this is the one that, has sort of the name itself has sort of become a shorthand for all this stuff. And it's kind of the leader out in the field. But it's not the only one. There is also Google's Bard, which sort of opened up early this year. This uses a different language model than ChatGPT and uses the resources of the Google search engine in order to formulate its results, which can have very different outcomes. I've done a number of tests where I've asked them both the same questions and gotten some interesting results. Um, the thing I do like about Bard is that it will generate multiple answers per query. And so you can, and sometimes those answers will be very similar to each other, and sometimes they can have very noted differences. Um, there's also one that I have been experimenting with recently, Microsoft's Bing AI, which is part of its Bing search engine. This has something of a different approach than the other two that I've listed. Be warned, if you do use Bing, it will try to link you to advertisements, so which is not something that the other ones do necessarily. So that's something to watch out for. Um, and it does have something of the interface that it uses is much more similar to what you would see in like a modern smartphone texting sort of app. So it has kind of a different design philosophy as well. Now, all three of the ones that I've listed are general systems, but as I've said, ones can be made for more specific uses. One that's very interesting to me is this one called Illicit, which is a system that is specifically designed around scholarly research and scientific papers. And it can do a lot of really neat stuff if you're interested in that sort of thing. Like, for example, if you call up a scientific paper or a journal entry, it will not only give you sort of the usual things that you would get in a database search, like the abstract and its subject headings and things like that, but it will also try to distill down what the central point or study was being done into a very short, concise kind of blurb. And it will give interesting citation statistics for that paper, including criticism from other papers about that paper, which I think is kind of neat. Um, there is another one that maybe you've seen some advertisements for called Dialpad GPT. This one is specifically designed around corporate uses and business solutions, kind of corporate communications. There's a lot of rethinking about how generative systems are being used in the workplace and what sort of their role in workflow is. And this is one example of that. Um, there's a very interesting one that came out early this year that maybe you've seen some news articles about called Pi, as in the letter, not the food. And this one purports to be a generative system that is meant to address like mental health issues and kind of social well-being. And it's a little unclear about how well it does those things. I've gotten some interesting responses from it in the past. So the jury is still out as to whether generative systems are a substitute for, therapy, but maybe one day, who knows? This is also not even getting into the image generators. The one you've probably heard of is DALL-E, which is made by the same company that makes ChatGPT. I say it's a free image generator. Right? Free is sort of in quotation marks because you have a certain number of free images you can generate before it then asks for you to pay for extra credits for you to create more images. And the basic concept behind a lot of these image generation is very interesting. It's able to accommodate a lot of different visual styles, which could include, you could make something that looks like a realistic photo. You could do something that looks like a painting in a particular style. There's some of these image generators can get very, very detailed and granular as to what you can do with them. And that includes Midjourney, which was one of the first ones to get real prominence. It's hosted on the social media app Discord and is used by a lot of artists and people who are sort of interested in visual design and things like that. And it's got a whole kind of community around it now that's sprung up in a fairly short amount of time. One that I have used a number of times is one called Deep AI, which is interesting because this one has a number of preset styles that can be selected, and then, you can have an image generated in that style. Like, for example, you could click on a thing that says, oh, I want this to look like a Renaissance era painting or something like that. And then it'll try to, whatever image you come up with, it'll try to fit into that kind of style. Literally, I could go on all night about how many of these things there are, but I think it'd be more instructive to move on to some examples of their usage. And this is one of my sort of earlier experimentations with it. So in this one, this was a test I did with ChatGPT, where I wanted it to give a list of scholarly sources for a research paper written for a college level English class about the representation of race and ethnicity in literature. So, what did it give me? Well, it gave me this list of books. What kind of books do we have on there? Well, there's The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. There's Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. We got The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. So all of these things, they're very kind of general. They're not terribly specific, but they are relevant to the question that I asked. I mean, I didn't ask about a specific ethnicity. I didn't ask about a specific type of representation. So it's decent for what I asked for it, but it's not terribly specific. Although, in that same response that it gave me, it also said to me, hey, if you're doing research on this sort of thing, then perhaps we can also suggest this list of scholarly journal articles that maybe you might want to consult. And I said, okay, all right, that's interesting. All right, what do we have here? So, like the first one on the list here is Race and Ethnicity in Literature by Susan K. Harris. Or we have Ethnicity and the American Short Story by Charles E. May. So these all sound pretty good. Like, these all look like they're things that could be interesting for my research. But here's the thing about this. Every single one of those articles doesn't exist. They're all non-existent. They're fake. Now the authors are real, and the authors have written about these topics, but they never wrote anything with those titles. Because I checked all of these, I did my due diligence. I scoured around a whole bunch of databases looking for all the things that these people wrote, and I looked at their publication lists and everything. The system is not necessarily there, and this is an important point. It's not necessarily there to give you the right answer. It's there to give you an answer that sounds right. In a sense, it's a very, very complicated, complex version of an autocomplete on your phone. It's trying to guess the next word that you want to say. I mean, this is doing it on a much grander scale, but you always have to keep that in mind. The analogy that I like to use is that asking something of a generative system is sort of like asking some guy. Now, it's some guy that has access to billions of different data points, but it's still some guy that you don't know. And so any answer that you get, it's always advisable to cross-check it and to sort of do your own double checking to determine whether or not something you get is real or just something that sounds real. And so I've done some other tests, and I just want to show you the levels of complexity that you can do if you're using a generative system. So recently in the news, there was all this talk about the Nagorno-Karabakh region and sort of the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so I thought, okay, well, I was reading that article. I didn't know where that was. So I asked the generative system, where is the Nagorno-Karabakh region? And then it gave me a pretty concise answer. It was like, oh, it's this place in the South Caucasus. It's in the southwest part of Azerbaijan. It's the subject of all this conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And that's pretty much correct. The thing I would draw your attention to about this response is that it didn't have, the most current information about the region, which was that it was seized by Azerbaijan from Armenia, because a lot of these generative systems will have cutoff dates as to when they can stop amassing information to put into them. for ChatGPT, if I remember correctly, it's September 2021. If you ask it anything that happened after September 2021, it's not going to know. Other systems may have their own cutoff dates. I don't know them offhand. But that's also something to keep in mind, is that they don't necessarily have access to all information everywhere. It has their limits. But what it can do is they can also accommodate more complex questions, things that maybe are not so easy to type into a search bar. So I asked this very complicated, or at least complicated to me, sort of math physics question about planetary bodies and orbits and things like that. And it gave me a very long answer, which I can't quite fit onto this screen, but they gave a very extensive answer and showed all of their work. They gave all the mathematical formulas that it was using, it explained every step of the process. And so that's not the sort of thing that would be so easy to just, pop into any other kind of thing and figure it out for you. And the other thing is that these systems are able to be used in a way that is even more complex than that and a little bit more abstract. So I have another one here where I was asking ChatGPT. I said, how much do you know about Phoenician languages? That's kind of an obscure topic. The Phoenicians were, people that settled and colonized a lot of places around the Mediterranean in the ancient world. And so it gave me, a fairly concise answer about the languages of the Phoenicians and sort of their root and a little bit about their alphabet. But I wanted to keep this conversation going. So then I asked, can you provide me with a sample glossary of known Phoenician words? Like, do you speak Phoenician, maybe? And they're saying, well, it's an ancient language, so we don't have a lot of it, but we do have all these. And so it gave me this big list of Phoenician words. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that it also wrote them in the Phoenician script. That is one thing that is very impressive to me about a lot of these generative systems, is that they have access to a lot of different languages, even really obscure ones. I've seen some results that when I was asking a while ago about like really, really obscure Native American languages that I didn't really think that anybody had access to. Obviously, I would probably need to consult with another source to see how accurate they are, but it's interesting to me that they have access to this many scripts, and especially non-Latinized scripts. But I also wanted to see if I could test the system a little bit more than that. So then I asked, can you extrapolate a fictional fantasy language from real world Phoenician? And here it got a little bit tripped up because it was saying, this is an interesting idea, and here's a bunch of things that you could do if you wanted to do it. It was trying to give me a little bit of a DIY, but it's not exactly what I asked for. And so I decided to push it a little bit further, see if I could expose some chinks in the armor, where I was saying, like, what sort of culture would develop this hypothetical fictional language that I'm talking about? Which is a very abstract kind of question. And here it kind of came through for me because it gave a pretty, not an extensive, but a pretty detailed rundown of us the answer that I sort of asked for. So there's a lot of different applicability, and you can get pretty creative about what it can and can't do for you. So I just wanted to show a little bit of an example of that. And part and parcel with that is this concept of what's called prompt engineering. Prompt engineering is a new and very fascinating study that is essentially all about how to talk to these generative systems, how to input, directions in a way that's going to give you the best results. And this kind of snippet here that I have is from a guide about prompt engineering, where, it's sort of advising you about when to be very direct, when to be, how much detail to include and how to include that detail. Here is a sample about, a pretty simple translation from English to Turkish. And it's sort of showing you about like in a very basic kind of text sort of way. But there's also other things to consider about it too. Here I have a sample from a prompt engineering guide about an image generator, which is talking about not just word order, but also how you organize the concepts that you're putting out into your prompts. So, like the one on the left-hand side, for example, that one says a cat sitting on a Martian table. Now, that is in fact a cat, the resulting image, but it is sitting on a table that is sort of stylistically, visually similar to Mars, which I don't think is quite what they were going for with this. And if you direct your attention to the one on the right-hand side, this one says a cat that is sitting on a table, the table is on Mars. Well, there is a cat, and that does look like the Martian surface, but it seems like the image forgot to put the table in there, so that isn't quite right either. Now, the one in the middle, we got this Goldilocks one that's just right. A cat that is sitting on a table on Mars. And that more or less is what you want. So, even very slight differences in language and presentation can have very different effects and results for what you're trying to do with these generative systems. And language is a big thing for how people can determine what has and hasn't been, generated this way. And by way of demonstration, I do have a little bit of a story about this. So, a number of weeks ago, a colleague of mine at the library reached out because they were communicating with a professor at my school who had reason to suspect that a blurb of text for a writing assignment from one of their students had been generated by I think ChatGPT. And they had used a detection program that they had found on the internet, of which there are quite a number these days, to try and figure out if it had been written by, an AI or a human. And they were asking us in the library, hey, is this the right, way to go about this? So they provided the text that they were working with. So I thought, okay, let me see what's going on here. So I ran that text through the program that they had used, and as you can see from the result here, the human probability was at 0%, which means they were saying there's pretty much 0% that this was written by a human being. This is absolutely made by like a machine, dead to rights. But I wanted to test it a little bit. And so I was like, well, let me try something. So I took that same bit of text and I put it through a different detection system. And that one, it's called GPT-0. This one was like, well, there's a 51% probability that this was written by a computer, which obviously is a lot more than, a 0% chance that it wasn't. And then I put it through another detection thing. And that one said, oh, this was obviously written by a human being. There's 0% chance that this was written by a computer. So, as you can see, it's not the most reliable thing in the world. It's not as though you can just plug something into one of these detection things and then that's going to give you the thing. The other sort of corollary to that is that even in that first detection one that said there was no chance that this was written by a human being, it also had a sidebar that showed the probability of each of how you could tell if each sentence was written by a human being or not. And some of them it was saying was written by a computer, and some of them it was saying that it was maybe written by a human being. So there's a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot of very funny results that can come about of it. I bet you didn't know that over 3/4 of the United States Constitution was written by a computer, according to these detection things. And the reason for that, by the way, is that because there's so many like for foundational documents like that, a lot of websites and programs will use them as part of the training for them, will use them as part of their basis somehow. And so when the, Chat GPT or Google Bard or whoever, is scanning out through the internet to collect their data points, they'll say, oh, look, there's this big thing of text that was generated for a website somewhere. It must have been made by a computer, probably. So it's not infallible. But the thing is that it's really, there's so many developments on this stuff pretty much on a daily basis at this point. There's a lot of directions that it can go. Um, One that I was reading about not too long ago is, for example, there's a company called Runway AI that has a generative system that they're hosting on Google Slack, which is their sort of communication system. And this one is able to generate really short video loops, not even just images, but video as well. And they're saying that one day people will be able to create maybe even more extensive and maybe even more realistic looking video. So that'll be very interesting to see. There's other kind of more niche aspects to it. There's a company called Alpha 3D out there that what you can do is that if you submit a two-dimensional image, it can use a generative system to create like a three-dimensional version of that image, essentially like, adding another dimension to it. Um, there's also could be some things to worry about. Even before generative systems existed, there was also always all this worry about deep fakes, they call it. Synthetic media, when people will put someone else's face in a video, or create like a false image of somebody, usually a celebrity or something like that. Actually, early this year, for example, there was this AI generated song that someone purported to be like a Drake song, and then a whole bunch of people believed it was an actual Drake song, and that caused like a big controversy. So there's gonna be along with the more positive aspects of this media, we also have to keep in mind that there are harmful things that people will do with it. But but again, there's also positive things. One thing that is very interesting about the newest version of ChatGPT, for example, is that if you can like input an image into it, and it will not only recognize what that image is, but it can also like generate a description of that image and come to conclusions about that image. Really, we're sort of in we're still in the nascent era of all this stuff. And so it really is up in the air with how much people are going to do with it. Um, Now, for my part, I have written this subject guide or lib guide about generative systems. It's called the Generative Systems Lib Guide. I started doing this on my library's website, partially because no one else was doing it, but partially because I knew that there was going to be a lot of call for this stuff in research and academically. It's grown a lot more than just in an academic context at this point. If you are so inclined, some of the stuff on tonight's presentation is also on there, and I have a few extra things as well. If you're inclined to check that out, that would be nice. But I think that now I want to come up with something more of a little bit of a demonstration for how to use all this stuff. So let me just see if uh, I don't know if I can see the chat right now, but let me stop sharing for a second so I can see if so. I put it out to everyone in the audience if there are things that they would be interested in seeing in terms of what generative systems can do, and then I can sort of show you through my screen if there's anything like that, if there's any sort of something professionally that maybe you're trying to do, or maybe just something you've always wanted to see how it would work to use it. Um, while you are thinking of that, I can start it up a little bit. So I'm just going to share my screen again here. So let me just, yeah, here we are. So over here, this is the OpenAI website. These are the people that make ChatGPT. Um, so you do need to make an account to use it. So I'm just going to log in with mine here and show you what it sort of looks like when you call it up. So yeah, so from here you can access ChatGPT, you can access DALL-E. I'm going to open up ChatGPT here. So this here is for anyone who hasn't seen it. This is sort of what the ChatGPT window looks like right now. It's a pretty sparse sort of system thing here. And let me just show you what it looks like when you type something into it. So let's say, for example, like people use the internet for a lot of medical stuff. What if we ask it something simple like, how do I know if I have a fever? And you're going to see that it is very fast now. Like I said, the speed, it's actually much faster than how it started out. And then, so, you have a response here. A fever is defined as, when you have a temperature between this and this, when you feel warm to the touch, when you have chills and muscle aches and all that stuff. And again, we can continue this sort of conversation. We can go, what is the best course of action if I have a fever? And then it's gonna, give us a list of things to do. It's gonna be like monitor temperature, stay hydrated, da da da. I mean, this is all kind of rote stuff, but it shows you that it sort of remembers what I was talking about. But what if we throw it like a curveball, right? What if we go something like, what do I do if I have a pet turtle who has a fever? I don't actually have a pet turtle, so this is not speaking from experience here. It's just the first animal that came to my head. So it's crucial to take prompt action. While reptiles have different physiological processes, they can still exhibit signs of illness or distress. You got to monitor the turtle's behavior, consult a reptile veterinarian, create a comfortable environment. So again, it's following the thread of the conversation. So that's kind of just a little taste. Oh, I see we have some things in the chat. Let's see. Okay, so the first one we have, if we wanted to create an image instead of searching for a free image for your website. Well, that I think can be arranged. So let me show you a little bit of what that looks like. Hold on. So over here, I'm going to show you DALL-E, which is an image generator. It kind of has a similar setup to ChatGPT. You can see here that there are some sample images here. Like, some of them are 3D renders, some of them are more of like a pop art sort of style. So, what if we were to put in something like generate a logo for the Lewisboro Library in the style of, let's say, a Salvador Dali painting, just because I think that would be amusing. So just to show you what this looks like, um, and again, I could have gotten a lot more specific with that. I could have been like, it has to be photorealistic, it has to be in. So over here we have some interesting results here. Let me open this up. So uh, again, going back to the sort of snippet of guide that I showed you about using image generators, they respond a lot to context, and sometimes they can come up with some interesting results. Um, this one, it almost looks like it's sort of an advertisement for biscuits. And again, I put in a very weird prompt, and so it's kind of given me weird results. This one, I'm not sure if this one really falls under the parameters of what I was asking for. Um, Another thing that's interesting to note about image generators is that there's some human features that they have a lot of difficulty with, particular hands and hair, I would say. This one, it sort of looks like they had a little bit of trouble with the face. Um, this one might be the closest to what I asked for. Another thing that image generators have a hard time with, ironically, is text, because, I mean, there is text. It's not what I would call legible text. Um, and so I see another thing on here that says, how do you add a voice that is not your own to a video you will post? I know that there are text to speech programs out there. I'm not much of an Instagram user, so I can't speak to the specifics of that. What I can say is that I can't remember the name of it now, but I know that there was a text to speech thing that I was using. And actually, I think that perhaps Google's Bard might have a speech functionality with some of its answers. So let me see if I can hold on. How do I just gotta move this thing over here? So let me see. Oh, nope, that's not. Sorry, my screen sharing thing is blocking a bunch of my tabs, so I just have to. There we go. Um, so over here we have Google's Bard. I was messing around with it a little bit before, but let's say we did something like create a synopsis of a random novel, just as something to make some text. And just to show you what these responses look like here, takes a little bit longer than ChatGPT, as you can see. So, okay, then so we have a very dramatic reading here. In the distant future, humanity has colonized the stars, da da da. And as you can see, there's also a listen function over here. I don't know if my computer audio will translate through the Zoom, but I can try it here. So yeah, so that's one functionality that Bard has, which is the ability to create speech out of text. Another thing, I've mentioned this before, but as you can see, Google Bard generates different drafts once you ask a question of it. So like we have another draft here that looks like the format is a bit different and the text is quite different. And we have a third one here, also different again. So that's an interesting sort of thing to me, is that it's able to create multiple different responses. Okay, I think I see some stuff in the chat here. Uh, ask ChatGPT what it would do if it won $10 million. I think, well, let's see. That's an interesting question. I don't know if I don't know if you're going to necessarily get what you want out of that, but it's interesting to see, sometimes it's fun to mess around with these things. So you could just go Chat GPT, what would you do if you won $10 million? I don't know if I should specify US dollars. I don't know what the exchange rate is, but let's see. Uh, if I, as an AI, won $10 million, I wouldn't have personal needs or desires. Yeah, wouldn't we all? If we consider this scenario in a hypothetical context, you'd invest in research, support education, contribute to humanitarian causes. This is making me feel bad. It's a lot less selfish than me. I think I'd just pay my mortgage. But let's ask the follow-up question to see how it follows the thread there. What if it was $1 billion? And then let's see. Well, it looks like not a terribly different answer. Philanthropic stuff, scientific research, education initiatives. So, one thing that I will say that's kind of related to that topic is that if asking generative systems for their opinions on things is a bit of a dice roll. They'll always be quick to remind you that they do not in fact possess anthropomorphic traits and things like that. So but sometimes they'll end up accidentally giving you opinions anyway. That reflects some of that bias that I was talking about, so that's something to be careful about. You may have to explain the difference in number of people it can hire. I'm not sure what that's in reference to, but Yeah. So we have I think we have a few more minutes if people have any more sort of requests or any questions that they want to hear about. Okay, here we go. So Grace says, you said the articles ChatGPT generated for you and were not real articles. Could you have asked that citations be provided, i.e., name, journal, date published, to ensure you are getting real articles? Well, it's funny that you say that. Um, Early on, when I was using ChatGPT for the first time, mostly to amuse myself, um, sometimes I would specifically ask it for citations, and then it would not provide me them. Or if it did, it would provide citations that either were non-existent, like the ones that I showed you, or were sort of formatted in kind of incorrect ways. Um, One thing I have heard about from a lot of my colleagues at the college is that it's kind of similar in terms of quotations. Generative systems, for like, you can ask it for a quotation from something and it will provide a quotation, but that, whatever blurb it has provided will be totally fictitious. They might name a real work, but it won't name necessarily something that was from that work. And this even extends to like the personal one. I know that there was at least one person at Bronx Community College that was asked for, that was quoted by this system as having said something that they never said. And actually, last month is kind of an amusing story. I was in my synagogue for Rosh Hashanah, and my rabbi's sermon was all about ChatGPT, and it all started for him because he got a random text message out of nowhere from someone who was asking him if a particular sort of writing was something that was attributed to him from like 1985, but it couldn't possibly have done that because he was a junior in high school in 1985. And then he's like, where in the world did you hear about this? And it's like, oh, Chat GPT told me. So it's, much like quoting a source that you're not personally familiar with, you do always have to be careful when you're quoting any of this stuff. Um, but yeah, again, in terms of sort of following on that thread, in terms of the veracity of information, there's a lot of kind of pitfalls to that usage. In my personal experience, for example, as Liz said before, I'm a metadata librarian. I work with records, I work with sort of bibliographic entries, and so far, these generative systems are not terribly good at doing my job, which I guess is good news for me personally. But for example, I um, I sort of found a book that did not have a pre-existing bibliographic record, and was published before September 2021, so it didn't have that excuse. And I asked it to create a metadata record for that book, and it did, but any of the information that it didn't have access to personally, it just sort of fabricated and made up information about it. And some of it was so close to what the actual information would be that you had to sort of have a trained eye in order to figure out if it was, trying to pull a fast one on you. Um, I can see if I can. Oh, you know what? I think I actually have that example over here. Notice also that when I did this example, it created this entire plain text window here. Um, so ChatGPT can be a bit creative in terms of the formatting that it utilizes. As a matter of fact, I was experimenting a while ago with making ASCII art, which is art made out of like different keystrokes, like a bunch of backslashes in a sort of formation to look like an image. And none of the images were particularly good, but I was mostly just impressed that it could do that at all. And so this is sort of a lot of what I work with every day, mark records and bibliographic entries, and the formatting is spot on. The actual information is kind of not so much. but the formatting is very interesting to me. And so that's kind of that's one example of sort of a lot of the capabilities of this sort of stuff. I do know that we're sort of running up against time, I think. So I think I'll just ask one more time if anybody has anything that they wanted me to address that I didn't get to, or something they wanted clarification, not do a recipe.
Uh,
Yeah, I could try and do a recipe real quick. Um,
while you're looking up
you
the
know,
recipe, I had a question. When you were talking about like the cutoff dates, like for example, the chat GBT was 2021. So that means that someone there is inputting all of this information into chat GPT.
from what I understand, because there's some opacity to this whole process, um, these systems use kind of automated what they call crawlers, which are programs that are designed to seek out specific types of information throughout the internet. And the thing was that they had to, I assume that someone must have selected some kind of cutoff date because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to release it because it would just would have kept gathering information and they wouldn't have, it's sort of like it's sort of like if you were making a sculpture. It's like you have to stop sculpting at some point. You can't keep sculpting it after the sculpture's done. Um, so I know that there is some human operation and direction in terms of how they do their information gathering, but I'm not sure I can say with precision as to what. That's actually one of the issues that a lot of these AI companies are facing these days in terms of what sort of their algorithms are and how they make the decisions that they do about what information can and can't go in, and how that information is utilized. You'll hear stories about how, well, if you ask ChatGPT how to make a bomb, for example, it's not going to tell you that. They've sort of put measures in place to stop it from telling you that. But people have figured out a way to, input something very precise and then it will give you that information. So there's a lot of issues that are raised about this sort of thing. Um, I'm putting in a recipe here because I've actually been wanting to make a red lentil stew for a while now. And then I want to see what it gives me. Is it saying that I have to put in lemon juice? I saw something about lemon juice down there. Or maybe I made that up. I don't know. I mean, so it's interesting, you can use it for, either very frivolous things or very important things. Let's see what I did. Is there, yeah, make it vegan. Yeah, because Bard, that's a good point that you raised actually. Because Bard is sort of powered by Google, it in theory anyway has access to more current information. The thing that I find is that ChatGPT, I think the main advantage with it is that its large language model is, I think, a little bit more thorough in some areas, and it's a little bit better at sort of technical things like sort of mathematics or things involving calculation. Um, so there's advantages and disadvantages to each, and it takes some experimentation to figure out some of that stuff. Okay, so it's giving me the vegan version here. I'm not sure if I personally am going to eat that, but that would be very useful to someone who is vegan, for example. So yeah, I know that we are. I think we're sort of just about out of time, but unless someone has any more burning questions they want to ask. But if not, I'm very thankful that everyone has come tonight. I hope I've given you a little bit of a taste of sort of what the field looks like these days and sort of what the capabilities are. And I encourage you to try out a lot of this stuff for yourself. A lot of this stuff, for me personally, it had to be learned through experimentation. It had to be learned through trial and error. And this stuff is always changing. Like, if you come back in a month and, maybe everything I said will be invalidated. So I would encourage you all to keep up with it and to have cognizance about all this sort of what generative systems are and what they do. So thank you to everyone. I hope everyone has a pleasant evening.